Okay, today's discussion is going to be some more about the skeletal system. This first part that we're going to talk about is the different kinds of bones that we find in our body. The very first kind is what's referred to as a long bone for obvious reasons. It's much longer than it is wide. These grow in a certain way. Most of these bones kind of grow in different ways, which is why we talk about them differently. Okay? The next kind of bone, and long bones, you can find those all over the place. Those are pretty obvious. That's your radius, your ulna, your humerus, your femur, your tibia, your fibula, all those sorts of things. Even the bones that make up your metacarpals and your metatarsals are actually considered long bones because they're longer than they are wide. The next kind are what is called short bones. Short bones are exactly that. They're short and blocky. They're basically squarish in nature. They're not really squares or cubes, all of them. Some of them are more rounded. Okay? But these short bones are basically about as tall as they are wide, that sort of thing. You can find these in your wrists. Your carpals are that, and your tarsals in your foot are what are known as short bones. Okay? Third kind is what's called a flat bone for obvious reasons. They're flattened out and wide spaces that they cover. A couple of major sections where you find them. The sternum, okay? It's very flat here and wider than it is thick. Okay? Also in the skull. The bones here are very thin and spread out over a very large area. They don't have to be perfectly flat, like you can lay them on a table flat to be considered a flat bone. It means that they're not very thick compared to how wide they are. Okay? Fourth category of bone that comes along is called an irregular bone. This is basically the miscellaneous category. This is something that isn't long, isn't short, isn't flat. It has different spots poking out on it. Vertebrae are a very common example of this because they've got spots and spines and what are called processes sticking out all over them, as well as things like your pelvis and your sacrum that have several different shapes to them. All right, next thing that we need to talk about is that bones are not what we often think them to be. They're not like the skeleton over here's bones, where they're just one solid piece. We have a tendency to think of bones as being one hard, solid piece, like a piece of plastic off of Ragnar the skeleton over here. Okay? They're not. They're actually living, growing parts of your body that have blood vessels. They have cells. They change over time. They can become sick. They are just like other tissues and organs in your body. Okay? They do have cells. They do have blood vessels. Okay? We have a tendency to think of the outside of the bone as being a hard, solid surface. And for the most part, it is. It's a very smooth, solid surface. It's called compact bone because it's the layers of tissue in it, the layers of calcified tissue are tightly packed together. They're compacted. And so they're very hard, very strong. But on the inside, we get a spongy appearance. Now, this is not soft like a kitchen sponge, though it's built like it. It's got all the holes Swiss cheese through it, like a sponge does. Okay? That spongy bone is still hard and calcified and rock-like. The pieces of it are not squishy. Okay? They just have holes through them. Through those holes, as you can see, blood vessels run around. Also, there will be tissues and cells in there. Okay? The most common place for those is in this big space down the middle of our long bones. It's called a medullary cavity. It's because this is where we have our bone marrow. Okay? Now, did you ever think about this for a second? A lot of us never stop to think. We know that we have bone marrow in the middle. And a lot of us even know what that bone marrow is for. It's to grow new blood cells. Now, in our old idea that a bone is a solid, hard object with no holes in it, how would those blood cells ever get out? See? A bit of a problem, right? Because actually, there are blood vessels that run in and through the bone that reach into that cavity and into those tissues that are making blood cells for us. Okay? So, that's one of the functions of the skeletal system that isn't about holding us up and attaching muscles. All right, let's move on a little bit and talk about how bones grow. Okay? Bones have to be able to grow. I mean, think about it. When we are born, our bones are one size. Over time, we get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and so does our skeleton. Okay? When we come out, our femurs, longest bone in our body, top of your leg, are about that long. Okay? At adult size, that thing is like this. Started out like that. Okay? Something's got to be able to change over time. If bones are just hardened things, that doesn't work. So, let's talk about the stages. Before we're ever born, the first thing that happens is we get a skeleton that's made of cartilage. Now, it's not the floppy cartilage like your ears and your nose, okay? It's more like the hard cartilage that goes along the edges of your ribs. It flexes as you breathe in and out, but it isn't something that's floppy or bendable very well, okay? So it's still a good thing for a skeleton. It's pretty solid, but it's able to be more flexible because the whole birthing process is a little bit rough on the skeleton, okay? Now, first thing that starts to happen to get to the bones like we know is it starts to form what's called a bony collar. It shores up the sides of it. It's like getting the construction site ready, okay? Because what's going to happen is it's going to start filling in the middle of it, okay? As we move on, that bony collar, notice that the cartilage is grown, because we can grow cartilage a whole lot better than we can grow bone. It's faster, okay? So we grow this cartilage, it gets a little bigger. As we get bigger, there are little cells that come along and burrow their way into the cartilage, and they're called osteoblasts. Osteo means bone, blast basically means to build. These are cells that build bone. So these guys come in here and they start secreting or spreading out this mixture of minerals that turns into solid, hard bone. Okay? And they start from the middle. Okay, we got the bone collar and then we've got this middle that starts. Now if those osteoblasts are going to hang out for very long, they're going to need resources, right? They're going to need oxygen. They're going to need food. They can't just stay in there forever. So what starts to happen next is as we grow bigger, notice we've grown more cartilage, this bone has gotten bigger. These are things that are happening after we've been born. Okay? We start in about here, about the time that we're born. We start this process. Blood vessels start to work their way in there. So we can feed those osteoblasts so they can do their job and build more bone. After a while, though, we start growing up to the point that we would like to eventually be able to stand up and walk and do things, right? Well, if we leave the ends of these bones, cartilage, and just a little squishy and flexible, that makes the whole thing a little tough to deal with. So the first thing we have to do is we have to grow hardened ends on these bones now. So instead of just in the middle, we start building on these ends. The end of a bone like that has the bigger, wider spot is called an epiphysis. And so this epiphysis will start to harden on both ends of the bone. And the middle will continue to grow in solid bone. Okay? Now, as we grow and grow and grow, the epiphysis gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It leaves a layer of cartilage out here to protect the end of the bone so that when two bones run into each other, they're not grinding against each other, because bone against bone doesn't do very well. It pinches things. So these cartilage ends that we leave are good. Okay? But it starts filling in. They start growing toward each other, and that gap gets smaller. Now remember, we can grow new cartilage. So this is how our body grows, is at these spaces here. Okay? Because we're able to grow some new cartilage and then turn it to bone. Grow some more new cartilage and turn it to bone. And so the bone gets longer and longer and longer, harder and harder, and stronger. Eventually, we get to the point where there's just this little sliver here at each epiphysis, where there's just a little bit of cartilage left. This is when we're up and walking around, and this would be about your age. Okay? Because at this stage, we're doing just a little bit of growing at a time. We're enlarging the skeleton a little bit. Now, what's eventually going to happen, though, is that when your body's done growing, it will harden the last part of this. This last part, that little, it's called an epiphyseal plate, but it's more commonly known as a growth plate. That's the one part where your bones can grow, is in these spots between where the epiphysis hardened and where the shaft of the bone hardened. That's where we grow by stretching that out and turning more and more of it to bone. Eventually, that will turn to solid bone and fuse together, and you stop growing. Okay? Alright, so that's basically how bones grow. Let's talk about how bones heal, though. Because bones get busted every once in a while. Okay? It's possible. Bones will break. Now, the problem is that when you break a bone, you're also going to tear the blood vessels that are inside of it, right along with it. Okay? So the first thing it's going to do is it's going to bleed into that space where the bone is broken. And it's going to fill that up. Now bones, if you notice back there a couple of slides, basically kind of have a cover around them. So that bleeding doesn't go all over the place. It doesn't make a big mess, usually, unless you really do a number on that bone. Okay? You may rip that covering and then it'll bleed out all over the place and you get all kinds of swelling and a mess, right? Okay? So the first thing that it does, though, is it fills this space up with blood. Blood that's out of blood vessels is basically a large bruise. Okay? It's known as a hematoma. That hematoma will form, and part of what it does is it acts like a splint to try and hold the pieces of bone where they're supposed to be. That pressure in there fills up like a balloon to pressurize that and hold it. As long as you haven't ripped up the bone real bad, this kind of holds things in place a little bit for you. Okay? Now, what your body will also do is it will swell everything that's outside here, because it's trying to rush all sorts of resources there to help wash away damaged cells, to bring nutrients so new cells can grow, and so that the bone can start to heal itself. That's what you see on the outside as the swelling. This is the part that kind of acts as a warning system, because what it does is it swells things up to try and make a splint, to say, hey, don't be dumb. You just hurt this. You can't move this. We're trying to heal here. Leave it alone. Well, that swelling also brings another nice reminder. That swelling pushes on nerves. Things get pinched. And so it hurts to move it. Which is another reminder from your body. Hey, stupid! Stop moving this. We're working here. We're trying to heal. Okay? So we want to avoid that sort of thing. So that's what all the swelling is about. That's the first thing. We form the swelling. We get the resources there to start healing. Okay? Over time, what will start to happen is your body will grow just like it grew a bone before. It's going to grow replacement bone. It's going to grow cartilage first. The first thing that it does is it fills up this space with cartilage, because cartilage is easier to work in. It's softer than bone. And it can make blood vessels go through that cartilage, because if we're going to grow new cells and we're going to repair, we got to get blood to the cells that we're growing, right? So the first thing it's got to do is it's got to fill up the space, and then it's got to get blood vessels in there. This is called a cartilage callus. Okay? That callus is basically just a spongy thing to hold everything in place. Now, this is the part where, from here to here is where they put you in a cast. Okay? Now the reason for the cast is not to help this heal. It's going to do this on its own. The purpose of a cast is so that the doctor can do what's called setting the bone. Meaning, setting the two pieces so that when they grow back, they're going to grow to each other and fuse together and make a solid, strong bone. There's no guarantee that if you break it and you just leave it there, that those bones are going to line up with each other. They can be all twisted, and then your bones and your muscles are going to be all stretched out wrong. And your bones and joints and muscles may not move properly, and you may have trouble using that limb from then on. This is why sometimes they will have to re-break it, set things so that they're nice and straight, and then put a cast on you so that it will grow back together appropriately. Okay? So this stage, your body is growing that. This would be inside your cast. Okay? It's going to grow that. Once it gets enough blood supply there, it's going to start feeding those osteoblasts again, those guys that build bone. Okay? And they're going to come in, and they're going to create what's called a bony callus. This is going to be bone that it's building back as quickly as it can. So it's going to build the spongy variety. It doesn't have time at first to start with the good, compact, strong bone. It wants to get it so that you can be back to strong again. When you're to this stage is where they're going to take the cast off of you. Okay? This is what they're looking for, is that yes, you've got some solid bone back in there, the bones have knit together, and everything's nice and neat in alignment. It's not going to move anymore if you move your arm or your leg or whatever you've broken. Okay? So they're trying to get you to at least the start of this stage and get this in good shape. Okay? Now, that's when you get the cast off. The last thing that's going to happen is over the next several months to even years, your body is going to come through with two kinds of cells. We talked about the osteoblasts that grow bone. But there are also others that actually shave off bits of bone and break it down. They're called osteoclasts. Okay? Well, the osteoblasts are in here rebuilding and strengthening this stuff into compact bone, while the osteoclasts are shaving away the old spongy stuff. And so they work together over a period of months and years to try and rebuild that bone back to the way it was before. So it's good and strong. All right, those are the things we need to talk about bones today. Go ahead and end the video.